Welcome to Beyond Well with Sheila Hamilton.
Testing 1, 2, 3, 4.
And welcome to 2020.
There we go.
2019 was our first year.
This could get just so much fun.
And we invited in some amazing guests.
Let's get a level on.
We had some amazing topics.
I know. I want that story.
And we'd like to thank you for supporting the show.
Yeah.
So we thought it might be fun before we dive headlong into the new year.
All right. Everybody's level looks good, right?
To take a quick look back.
Okay.
At a few of our faves from 2019.
3, 2, 1.
This show was from very early on in the series and features author Cheryl Strayed and her unique take on how to bounce back from grief. It begins with Sheila explaining to Cheryl what Beyond Well, the podcast, is.
This podcast is called Beyond Well, and what we do is every week we look at a different part of being human. So we decided to use, because you're so good on the topic of grief
Awesome.
with you. Yeah, just because I think there's nobody. I actually put you right up there with Joan Didion.
Oh, thank
I really
you.
do. I think there's been two writers who have kind of defined what grief can do for us and how to take a different perspective on it, you and Joan. Mm-hmm. And I think you relate more to more audiences. I would have loved to have Joan in, but she wasn't available. So, Joan, in case you're listening, that's why Cheryl's here. I was listening to an amazing conversation with you and Lydia and Pam Houston the other night, and the guy got up and said, this person needs no introduction, Cheryl Strayed. And I was like, she needs an introduction so that people know your history of writing, how long you were at it before you had this breakout memoir, Wild,
Thank you.
how hard you worked at becoming a writer and sort of understanding the human condition, that you've been translated in 50 languages, that you have had a movie made about your life, that you have had plays made about your life. I was like, no, introduce her. So that's what I just did. Welcome, Cheryl Strayed.
Oh, thank you. You're so sweet. Are we on? Are we recording?
Oh, yes.
Oh, we can put these headphones on?
If you like them,
I don't
don't
to.
like listening to myself in them, but if you like it,
You don't have to. It just makes you feel more official.
it
No, I
does.
don't-
It
Jenna?
does.
We don't need to be more official.
Jenna?
Yeah.
Brian.
Okay.
Yeah, it does sort of help with, I think, the feeling of how your voice is coming off in your ear, but I'm so
Right.
used to it by now, and
Me
you
too,
probably
yeah.
are too. So in your memoir, Cheryl, Wild, I found one thing that you said. I went through and I looked at almost every passage about grief, and you said, I'm just going to find it because you said grief. Okay. The deepest thing I know about loss is that grief is love. It is love. It is not sorrow. It is beauty, not ugliness. I was like, oh, the reason that resonates with me? Because when you're in grief, you can't see anything but its ugliness.
Right. Because it's so painful.
Right.
I mean, very often when we lose somebody who's essential to us, it is the deepest pain
Right.
that we'll ever experience.
Yeah.
And it's a pain that doesn't go away, that doesn't, act the way we expect it to act. Like it hurts a lot at first and then it gets a lot better and then it's gone. That's not what grief does. And for me, that realization that there's a reason it hurts so much, because you have so much love. Mm-hmm. And when I reached that point in my own grief over my mother, that I began to be able to see that really, yes, this hurts, but what a gift that I loved this person so much and felt so loved by her that I would love her forever. I still marvel at that, how much I love my mother so many years after she's disappeared.
We talk about this idea that the reason you have this hurt is because you have this great love and great attachment. You can't have one without the other, right?
Right.
But it's complicated by a mother-daughter relationship. And I haven't heard anybody delve into this with you. Was there ever the point at which you regretted, for instance, when your mother went to college with you, that you didn't let her walk with you? That you weren't, because you were in the teenage years when you lost your mother, was your grief complicated by how we are as human beings when we're teenagers?
Absolutely. And I want to hear Jenna and Brian talk about this too. But I know what I learned by writing about my grief is that I am in a very specific category of people, when you lose a parent, when you're in your teen years or early 20s, those are the years where developmentally your job as a human is to separate from your parents.
Yeah.
To push them away, not necessarily in a way that's negative, but just to say, listen, I need to make my own life now. I need to separate myself from you and define myself away from you. That's healthy development, right? And what happens when you lose a parent in the midst of those years is that, yes, you're filled with remorse over all those times that you weren't as pleasant or as welcoming or as frankly honest about how much you love that person. And I was tormented for years about that. I've written about that in all of my books, about those times that I said something really ridiculous to my mother. Like it's in the movie too. It's in the book. One time I said to my mother, "Isn't it amazing how much more sophisticated I am at this age than you were at this age?"
Which is I know,
right? And my mom just laughed. Of course, by that age she'd had 2 kids. But I was in college and I was reading books, and all she was doing was taking care of babies. And at that age, my arrogance was so delusional, like it is when you're a teenager or in your early 20s. And so, yes, I thought about that a lot. When my first short story won an award, and it was about her, it was about my life with her as a single mom. She very proudly said to her own mother, "Cheryl's story is about me." And even though it was true, I snapped at my mom and I said, "It isn't about you, it's fiction." Which is ridiculous because it was totally, autobiographical fiction. But it was, again, this moment where I was, I was trying to separate myself. And so I'm haunted by the things I said to my mother in those years, like so many people are haunted by those things. But what I had to realize is that I had to forgive myself for them. And what was beautiful is I knew my mother forgave me the instant they happened.
Yeah, exactly.
Because my mom knew I was a teenager in my early 20s.
Yeah. Do you guys, when Cheryl talks about the complications of grief and the different types of grief, have that thought that if we brought in 25 different guests, we'd have 25 different experiences with grief? You're never going to find kind of uniform, one thing that really bugs me is the 5 stages of grief.
Right.
It doesn't really feel like it's grounded in any kind of science or any kind of personal experience, for sure. And it makes people feel as if perhaps they're not having the right experience with grief.
Yeah, and I would say that not only is everybody's experience of grief different, but your experience of different types of grief is likely to be very, very different. When your mom dies, that's going to be a very different experience for you than when somebody else that you love dies. And I think the experience is just so much more about the relationship that you have versus this thing that we call grief, that everybody's supposed to go through these exact stages, or like you said, Cheryl, it's really intense at first and then it fades and then it's over. It just doesn't work that way.
Yeah. I've spoken with many people who have partners who have suffered for a long time with mental illness, and they talk a lot about the guilt that they feel from being relieved. That their grief is really compounded by this idea that I'm actually relieved that this is over because it was a harrowing journey.
Yeah, I think that's one of the really difficult messages we give people who are grieving, is that there's this right way to feel, and it's primarily sadness. You should just feel intensely sad and nothing else. You shouldn't feel relief. You shouldn't have any joy in your life during those times when you're grieving. And it's just like any relationship. You still have a relationship with this person, and it's a complicated relationship.
Did you, I was so struck by how much deep wisdom you pulled out of your heart and your soul at such a young age, Cheryl. And as far as I know, you weren't going into therapy. You weren't doing anything more than deep reading and writing, correct?
Right. Yeah, and I think that, as an advice columnist and advice podcast host, I'm always telling people to go to therapy. Yeah. I've never done that myself.
Yeah.
But, writing has been my therapy, and reading and deep contemplation. I do in my own life what therapists ask their clients to do all the time.
Yeah.
And I think that, I just want to mention, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross with those 5 stages of grief. When I first was grieving in my 20s and became aware of her, I was angry at this idea. How dare anyone say I should feel this, and this, and this in order? And, now I have come to really understand that, we've misinterpreted her work. And I want to just say that she was really revolutionary and important in the way we think about grief, because she was one of the first people to say, it isn't just sorrow.
Right.
There is rage. There is denial. There is. Yeah. So, I do think that that's a misread of her.
Yeah.
And so what I did is I said, hey, I do feel all these different ways.
Yeah.
I'm the most sad, but I also feel angry, and I also feel all these other things.
Sure. I think the problem is when we talk about them, when they've gotten interpreted as stages, then we sort of think, oh, it's a stage, and I'm supposed to go through them in this linear way.
Yeah.
Well, and they're called stages, right?
Right, of course.
Yeah.
Right.
I tend to accidentally think in metaphors, and what's showing up in my head is this idea that you go to some multi-course dinner, and they first bring you an appetizer, and it's small, and you get 4 bites, and then they take it away, and then now here's your salad,
right.
And then here's your main, and then here's a dessert, and that's, I think, sometimes how we think of the stages of grief is, first there's this thing, and you have just a little bit of it, and then once you're all done with that, then you move on to the other thing. And I think the stages could be better thought of as a potluck, where, it's there are these different things that you eat, but you might be like, I'm going to have seconds and thirds of that.
Well, and
I just keep
movable
coming to
feast.
that, or I'm going to have the dessert
A movable
feast.
feast.
so
Because
great.
different things at different times come up.
Great.
Yeah.
Like in my 20s, I might have been angry. I wrote about it in Wild on my mom's 50th birthday. I was on the Pacific Crest Trail, and I just woke up so mad. I was just mad that she didn't live to be 50. How dare she? And then, 15 years later, I'm at the zoo with my kids, and I'm seeing all these grandmothers with their grandchildren, their daughters with their mothers and their own kids. And then I'm angry, why don't I get to have a grandmother in my life for my children? There's different kinds of, they come around again and again in different ways.
That's right. And it's I'll have some more dessert.
That's right.
And I think acceptance gets thought of in the same way, I just need to accept this. And then it's okay, well, now I've accepted it.
No.
And people don't really, I think, get a handle on the idea that it's no, actually you have to accept things over and over again, sometimes many times in a very short period. And then years later, this thing pops back up where you're but why?
Yeah.
God, this sucks. And you've got to do that work again.
Cheryl, one of the really fascinating things I think is your perspective on the activities you did use during that time that you were really searching, when you kind of turned to drug use, when you were in a really bad marriage, you were way young and got married, you were searching, but you reflect on those things as moving you toward yourself. I want you to talk about that a little, because it's such a healthy perspective of not kind of shaming that girl who made those choices.
Right. I mean, I think that, and this is where, therapy and writing come in, is that you get to really take apart some of the choices you've made and figure out why you made them. And that always leads to a sense, I think, of not only deeper understanding, but a deeper sense of forgiveness, that you forgive yourself for the mistakes you made and eventually see them as gifts. And that's certainly true for me. When I look back, I can see so clearly that the 20-something me who decided to be really sort of risky and do destructive things, self-destructive things, I was really just trying to show the world how much I loved my mom and how much she mattered. Because my mother was not a notable woman in the ways that we consider people, notable. She was an ordinary woman who basically was just a good mom. The only time she ever even appeared in the newspaper was her obituary in her whole life. And I couldn't believe that the world just went on. I know that's a really cliche thing to say, but that's what people feel when somebody they really love dies, is how can everything around me seem so normal when everything's different? And I'd always been this ambitious girl. I was always going to rise up, and I was going to, from the circumstances in which I was raised as basically a kid in poverty, and I was going to make my mother proud, and I was going to buy her house, and I was going to live our life. And then when she died, I thought, okay, to prove my love for her, to show everyone how much she matters, I'm going to ruin my life. I am not going to make good on my intentions.
Wow.
Now, when I was deciding to use heroin or, sleep with a bunch of men or do this or that or the other thing, I wasn't thinking that consciously.
not.
But I so clearly see that now. And thankfully, what happened is I intervened in my own life. I thought, you know what? I just woke up and I want to honor my mom. I have to become the person she raised me to be. And I have to find a way to do that. And for me, that acceptance, Brian, that word acceptance, I think is the most important one in my life when it comes to living with my grief in a way that allows me to thrive rather than holds me back. Is that acceptance to me is about accepting the fact that you're always going to have to carry that burden.
Right.
That one of the things that I have to carry is that I will never, ever, ever have my mother again. And that's a heavy burden, but I can bear it. And, we're speaking in metaphors here, but that's so much what happened when I decided to take that backpack I couldn't lift all that way on the Pacific Crest Trail. When I was doing with my body what I needed to do with my soul, and it taught me how to do it.
You talked about in your book the self-reliance that you had when you said in your tent, you'd say, "Who's tougher than me?" The answer was always the same. And even when I knew absolutely there was no way on this earth that it could be true, I said it anyway. No one. I'm like, there has never been in a time I have talked to myself in such a beautiful, kind, and self-assuring way.
Oh, Sheila, you should. You should talk to yourself like that.
But did it come from the trek? Did it come from this deep, deep connection that you had with your mother? If you think about who you are as a person, where did that strength come from?
It's so interesting. This is always the hardest question to answer. Like, how are you like you are?
Yeah,
why are you?
Right.
I don't know.
Yeah.
What I can say is, I sort of blush when you read that line because, of course, women especially are not allowed to say things like nobody's tougher than me. But what I want to say, where I'm coming from with that self-talk, is I don't believe that that actually I'm the toughest person on the planet. But what I believe is in order for me to do the hard things, I have to just tell myself that positive thing. Even though, that's what I would do with fear too. When I would say, I'm not afraid, I would say it when I was afraid. So it's just a method I use. Like, I do this too. When I went through the whole red carpet season with Wild, I was always standing next to Reese Witherspoon and Laura Dern. And I just decided at the outset, like, you are not going to say mean things to yourself about your body or the way you look.
Man,
you're just not allowed. And so I would look in the mirror and be like, you are beautiful. But I would say that when I didn't feel beautiful. It's just a method.
Yeah.
It's like being mindful about the voice that you allow into your head. It's a very powerful voice.
Does this fit with your experience in the tent when you said, like, nobody is stronger than me? I was thinking nobody can occupy my space better than me. Like, I sometimes think there's got to be people who are better at their lives than I am. But nobody is better at my life than I. Like, if I don't pick this up,
that's right.
No one will, because nobody's in my skin. Nobody's in my head. If not me, then who?
Yeah, and I think, as you know, there's a difference between that and being a raging narcissist. Of course, I am not actually marching around going, I'm beautiful and I'm brave and what I'm doing is I call this voice in my head your inner terrible someone, your its. And we all have it. You all know who that is, right? We're all familiar with that person. And then it's just that you have to decide, like, are you going to let your its rule your life or not? And so I just say, hi, its, guess what? I'm still going to write. I'm still going to put on a dress and walk the red carpet. I'm still going to go hiking. I'm still going to whatever, you know? And so you just welcome them and then laugh in their face. And that doesn't mean that you actually think so highly of yourself, but you just decide not to let the lowest version of you rule your life.
Yeah. Do you ever have those moments? Cheryl has two beautiful kids, Bobby and Carver, and I was curious if you, in thinking about your mother, sometimes think, oh, I just turned into my mother, and then sometimes think, shit, just turned into my mother. Do you have that?
I guess, it's interesting.
And which experiences evoke which responses?
Well, it's definitely, my mom was a very loving mom, but yeah, I remember her yelling at us a lot about like how messy our rooms were.
Yeah.
Why can't we do this? And yeah, I become like a yeller sometimes, just like my mom. And also a lover. One of the greatest gifts that my mom gave me is, even if she wasn't a perfect mom, I always felt completely loved. Me and my siblings all agree on that. Like, we always knew our mother loved us so much.
Yeah.
And I think that's the most important thing to give your kids. And so there are all these ways that I feel like, oh God, I feel guilty about this, or I shouldn't have said this, or I shouldn't have lost my temper about that. But they always feel loved. So I see my mom in that the most.
Yeah.
I was thinking of your mom when you were talking about being there in the tent, and that kind of voice that you have about like, who's the toughest? I'm the toughest.
Right.
And like, that's what good parenting does. Good parenting kind of reflects back to your children some external voice that you want them to be able to kind of eventually over time internalize, not in a belief of you're perfect, but that there's this other part that isn't just the scared part, that isn't just the, oh my gosh, I can't do this. And you were able in that time to kind of, whether you thought of it as your mom, but something got internalized, that you had this other voice there to be able to give you a different perspective.
Yeah.
I think it's especially
Absolutely.
fascinating, given that you witnessed a lot of domestic violence, a lot of poverty. There was food scarcity. You're living in rural area with no running water. And so you're still looking to the one human in your life who is reassuring you, no one is stronger than you. No one is stronger than you. That's all you needed, one human.
Yeah.
To me, that gives me so much hope, especially for young people that are in really dire circumstances, that if they have that one mentor, one human who's saying, no, here's how you become strong, that they can be okay.
Yeah. I think what that's about too is really believing, this goes back to what you were just saying, Jenna, too. It's like believing that you have the capacity to do things, believing you have the capacity to heal, believing you have the capacity to go on when it feels like you can't.
Yeah.
Believing you have the capacity to find love when all is lost, and to take that next step. And I do think that is such an important shift to make when you do feel such deep despair or sorrow. When it comes to grief, very often a phrase you hear people say is, I couldn't bear it. I couldn't live. If my child died, I could not live. And what we know is that that's a lie, because there are so many people out there, so many people listening right now who have lost a child and who are living, and who have, many of them, found a way to thrive and to turn that ugly thing into something beautiful.
Yeah.
And one thing I wrote in Tiny Beautiful Things, I answered a letter, this man whose only child had been killed by a drunk driver, is, I said to him by way of advice is, you have to, I think that the final stage of grief, I don't believe in these stages, but if there is an end to grief, it is when you make that transformation, where you take the ugliest thing, your deepest burden, your heaviest burden, your deepest curse, and turn it into a blessing, into a gift, into something that you give to others, that you bring beauty into the world via the channel of your deepest sorrow. And I think that that's ultimately so healing. It's about having the capacity to go on, that allows us, I think, to find that joy again.
Yeah, go ahead, Brian.
Yeah, there was a word, Cheryl, that you used earlier on about carrying it. I think that was the phrase that you used. And in that, there's an assumption that you're going somewhere. And my experience, both with pains in my life and in clients that I've worked with, is that grief, sorrow paints with this really, really broad brush. It's like painting with a roller, and it just covers everything. And I've had clients who in the midst of despair will say, I've always felt this way, or I always will feel this way. And it just kind of just overwhelms any other space for anything. And I think this idea that, what I need to do is, quote, process or I've got to get past it. It's like I've got to make room for other stuff, and then I'm going to bring this along. I carry it with me. So when you talk about making it a gift or you use it in some way, it's like, no, this colors my perspective now, maybe in some really hard ways, but also in some really beneficial ways in terms of compassion for other people.
But that also goes back to the other word that you were talking about, Cheryl, which is capacity. Like, what if grief and loss, like, what if that increases our capacity? It's not.
I think it does.
Yeah. It's not that you have to figure out a way to get rid of this so you can go on with your life, but rather, if you think about like carrying this with you, your capacity is now just increased. You're going to carry this and all the other stuff in your life along with you.
Well, you were joking in the panel that I was referring to the other day about whether or not our kids who have been spared of a lot of the tragedies and harm, will they be able to be artists? Can they create? Is there a way that they're going to be able to find this? I think they will. Their imaginations are quite big and their empathy is huge, but it does provide you an insight that sometimes you're forced to take, really.
It's hard to teach grit.
Yeah.
Well, and it's also hard to protect our kids from that grit. I mean, right now, so far, my kids things have gone swimmingly for them. But Sheila, as you know, you don't know what's going to happen in their lives. And, we can protect them and we can, my kids have a very different childhood than I had in terms of just access to resources and economic privilege. But I don't know. They something terrible could befall them at any moment, right? And then they have their life. I mean, that's the scariest thing about being a parent, I think, is, I want my kids to be little precious cupcakes all of their lives.
We all do.
They don't have to be artists. They could be like, I don't know, what kind of precious cup. They could have a cupcake shop and just live to, happily ever after and never have their hearts broken and never lose anyone. And, but that's probably not what's going to happen.
Sometimes the hardest thing is the fact that they did have it easy. I was remembering this conversation with Tommy Hilfiger on a program where he was talking about his kids are really struggling to find themselves because he has raised them to be able to have everything they want. He's raised them to think that they can come in and take over the brand. He's raised them to be able, and his hardest thing is that none of his kids are doing well because they cannot find their own sense of what is theirs, what they need in the world. So, it's like, of course we want to protect them, but sometimes the biggest pain might be actually in the fact that we protected them.
Well, we often think of pain as this like inevitable part of life, it's just going to sort of show up and you have to make room for it. But there's another side to it. Like, pain teaches us something.
Yeah.
Like, pain teaches us what is most important to us. It's like this GPS to what is most meaningful and important to us. And so even if it were possible for you to spare your children or, the loved ones in your life pain, you're really robbing them of this opportunity to learn and really be in contact with what actually really matters to me.
Under most circumstances, we don't have to create those opportunities. I want you to grow up to be a really competent person, so tonight you're sleeping outside.
I'm already starting to form a business a plan in my head of like, I could do a camp where it's like hardships for your privileged cupcake children.
Everyone's stuck on a rock.
It's called Camp Cupcake.
That's enough. That's enough of a hardship.
Send me your cupcakes and I'll make them into mud pies.
I'm very curious how you deal with the expectation that because you've had enormous success, both as an author and as an advice columnist, that people now assume that you never have grief.
Oh, right. Or that, or
that
also that I'm just like this font of wisdom too, or that I don't have struggles in my own life. Yeah. I know, it's funny. I've always tried to convince people that that's not true. The kind of advice I give is very much that I'm down in there with the person asking me for advice. And I'm saying, here are the experiences I've had. Here are the mistakes I've made. This is what I struggle with too. But people really don't want to believe that. And I think maybe this happens too with therapists. It's like they want to put you know all the answers. So your marriages must be perfect. And you know that that's not true, right? And or whatever. I don't mean your marriage is probably great, but your life,
me a little bit. But no,
sure, yeah, of course.
And I think that that's projection. I mean, I didn't go to school. I'm not a psychologist. I think that I just say, I laugh it off and say, I'm struggling too. And the minute people meet me, they understand that I'm not as whatever idea they had of me.
I also just love though that you've made it a practice to be open about the hardest parts of your life.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of people, especially that's a mistake that you make when you're writing, is that you attempt to put your best self forward. And really what people are kind of looking for is, where's the human part of you? Where is the part of you that's doubtful, suffering, that has all the things we have every single day,
And also thriving.
Yeah,
because it does feel like we have like one or the other. We either have, oh, wow, that person is really having a hard time.
Yeah.
Or we have the person that we put up on the pedestal and their life is perfect.
Right.
We have very few examples. And Cheryl, I mean, this is one of the reasons I have so much respect for you. We have so few examples like you of people who have both at the same time, because that's what being a full human is.
That's right.
Thank you.
I want to ask you, because I know that it's difficult to talk about what you're doing because you're back in writing and you don't want to tell us the project. Mm-hmm. But are you more faced with the realities of your loss when you're quiet and in your office writing again and being very reflective? Or are you more faced with it when the lights on the red carpet are flashing and you're at these big Hollywood parties?
Right.
When do you feel it most? I'm always curious about that because people tend to have different reactions to when they actually get into that.
I would say that, it's two different kinds of experiences. When I'm writing, it feels like I'm doing deep emotional work, whether I'm writing about my grief or any aspect of my life, that you go to those deep places. What's the truest thing? And to find the truest thing, you have to remember as much as you can. You have to remember the things you thought you forgot. You have to go back and interrogate yourself. Why did I do that? What was I thinking? What was I feeling? Mm. And inevitably, that brings up so many emotions. You cry. This is what I mean. It in some ways replicates what I think happens in therapy.
Yeah.
And so, it can be an emotional journey, but I've never experienced that as a burden. Mm. I feel wrung out sometimes after a day of writing, like that kind of deep writing, but I feel also filled up, in the spotlight. What's interesting, there's this line in Tiny Beautiful Things, actually in the title column, that I've read out loud so many times that this column, and there's a line that says, some people who seem to be, I'm going to paraphrase myself, but some people who seem to be gliding right along are suffering and have suffered. And whenever I would read that line, it was the summer of 2012, and Wild was number 1 on the New York Times bestseller list, and Tiny Beautiful Things was number 5, and I was going crazy. Like, I was so busy, and I had 2 little kids, and every time I would read that line, somebody who might seem to be gliding right along is suffering or has suffered. I would get tears in my eyes because that's what I was feeling a lot. I was feeling like on top of the world, but inside myself, a lot was happening.
Yeah.
And it was hard.
Yeah.
And I was experiencing all kinds of emotions, missing my kids, wishing my mom were here to be proud of me, like all of those things. And so, I think that can be really alienating. What I've figured out is when I'm the saddest is when what you see is not what I feel inside. That like if there's a distance between how I'm feeling and what you think I'm feeling, being in that moment,
right?
That is so alienating.
Yeah.
And I couldn't say in front of those crowds, stop at that line and say, I'm feeling sad right now. Because they'd be like, are you kidding me? You have a New York Times bestseller. Why are you complaining? Uh-huh. So, to learn how to be honest, even in those moments of victory and triumph is really hard. Because, people don't often have sympathy for you.
Well, it's such an amazing point.
Yeah. And like what Jenna was saying, Cheryl, about you carrying both of those things, it seems like when you're writing, you could potentially sort of fall into the abyss, and then when you're on the red carpet, There's almost a denial of that other part.
Yeah, there is no abyss. It's all glamour and light.
Yeah, it's all happy clappy and kind of, and really the truth is, no, I've got these things that are side by side, and the black doesn't make the white any less white, and the white doesn't make the black any less black.
Yeah.
And I think you just said such a truism there about suffering in general, that the times when you feel most sad are when you feel sort of isolated, when your insides don't match how other people are perceiving you. And I think that is probably the case for all of us in all of our suffering. Like at the heart of suffering, at least for me and for many of the people I serve, it's when we feel a disconnect, when we feel like we don't have a sense of belonging with at least one other that like really knows us, because we're such social critters.
Yeah.
I mean, we are incredibly social creatures. And so when it feels like you're not being seen, that's just profound suffering for all humans, I think.
It is. And especially I think when you feel like a lot of people do, that they in order to be loved, they can't be seen.
Yes.
That they have to look a certain way, they have to be at a certain weight, they have to have a certain kind of attitude or wear a certain dress or whatever it is. That artifice never makes us happy.
Yeah.
Right.
And that happens in grief all of the time.
Yeah.
Either people will say, oh my gosh, people can't be around me because I'm too sad or down, or they can't be around me because right now I just happen to be feeling joy and I'm remembering my mom, and that's really off-putting to people. And so they feel like they have to like manage their grief in some way.
Yeah, why are people are judgy of other people about their grief?
Yeah.
Isn't that
God,
interesting?
super judgy.
I mean, they really are.
I will never forget talking to a woman at a suicide conference. She had lost her son a year earlier, and she had taken him to college. His first day of college, her kids launched, that time when a parent is supposed to relax and say, I did my job. And he walked down a pier and jumped into the water and died by suicide. And her friends said, my friends were so unbelievably helpful in the first 2 months, 3 months. At 6 months, they started kind of not inviting me to their parties because I really was not done grieving. And at 1 year, they actually formed an intervention that said, you should be done with this and starting to move your life. And I couldn't fathom friends like that. I honestly, but she said it was incredibly alienating for her that they were on a timeline that she wasn't.
Yeah.
And that happens.
I've gotten that a lot, a lot. And I mean, what I know is that I've also talked to, thousands of people all over the world who walk up to me and say, you said exactly how I feel. You wrote exactly how I feel. So I know the truth of that. But every once in a while, there will be people who say, well, you shouldn't still be sad after 10 years or 1 year. Like there's a timeline. And I'm curious for both of you, I've read that there's, I guess, is it a clinical term, like complicated grief or, a grief that, I get it that sometimes, obviously it's bad if your grief holds you back, from the rest of your life. But it's not bad to still feel sad 20 years after somebody dies. I would expect this woman you met to feel sad about it forever, right?
Yeah, right.
So what is, can you talk to us about basically grief being pathologized? Is that the right word?
Yeah, sure is. Well, what we do is we draw blood and we look at it and we say, oh, you have the complicated grief.
No, and we take a picture of your brain. We do a brain scan and we take your blood. Yes. Because if it's the brain, it's real.
There's all sorts of things that get pathologized. And I think Jenna and I are cut from the same cloth in the sense that we don't buy into that paradigm. My estimation is that I don't want to pathologize it, but I want to say like there are ways that we relate to our internal world that either helps us be about the things we most deeply want to be about, and there are ways that we interact with our internal world where it pulls us away from being about what we want to be about.
That's so well put.
So
that's like
it's
your inner terrible someone.
Yeah.
Versus your
exactly right.
inner good someone.
Yeah. So I can see how my grief or loss, for a time, I am going to sort of check out. I'm going to take a little time off work. I'm going to wear the black. I'm going to mourn. And then there's somewhere in there, it isn't so much putting it away or getting past it, but it's like at some point I do want to find a way to carry this with me and still engage in the world in the here and now versus in the there and then. And there's a way to bring that experience of the there and then with me into the here and now and still be about things. Sheila, Cheryl, you've both done that. Jen, I'm sure you and I have done that too, because as we are wont to say, we are all in the soup.
Same
together.
soup.
Yeah,
Right, and
all
there's
in the
so many
same
times when you say things, I'm like, yeah, what he said. We do think about these things very similarly.
I should have Dr. Phil come in one day and just disagree with both
yes,
of you.
you definitely
That
have.
would
Everything.
work. And we would say,
Yep.
that is not exactly what I would say.
Yep. If you want conflict, bring him in. But I think if you're talking about kind of quote unquote complicated grief, the way I would understand that is it doesn't have anything to do with the intensity of your emotion. It's not like, well, if you're on a 8 and above on the scale of grief, then that means it's complicated. I would say grief, I don't even know what complicated grief means. That's to me not a very helpful term, but very much what Brian was saying, it has to do with, can you have all of your life? And we go back to that idea of acceptance. And I love how you talk about acceptance, Cheryl, because it's so different than many people talk about acceptance. And you talk about it in your writing simply as, can you have what is? Like, can you take this also with you? It's not being okay with it. It's simply like, could I pick this up that's already there in my life and live my life, bring it along with me?
Yeah.
And I think when people are in a place that they don't have the resources or they don't know how to bring it with them and continue to live their life, then they might need some help from writing and or therapists or whoever to help them learn how to keep on with their journey.
Yeah. I'll add to this too, that the acceptance piece, it seems like sometimes people have this notion, well, if I accept that thing that happened, then I'll stop feeling so bad about it.
And then you feel guilty.
Absolutely.
Right.
Yeah.
And it's like, actually, I think the message that I would want is, no, actually what you're accepting is the thing that happened and the emotions that come along with that.
Yeah.
You're accepting that whole bundle of it.
I also just want to touch on how beautiful it is in a deep stage of grief to be completely aware of how open and vulnerable one is. I mean, I remember after I've had so many different times of feeling intense grief, but one of the beautiful things was actually having a conversation with a friend and thinking, I'm listening deeper than I would have ever listened because of my grief.
Yeah.
I'm actually enjoying the people at this party because they're being tender about my loss because of my grief.
Yeah.
It allows us to have kind of a clarity around life sometimes, that if we can hold on to that, there's some really beautiful things that start to be cultivated from.
Yeah. That's the pain teaches.
Right.
Well, and I think though that intensity, I know exactly what you're talking about, but I think it scares people. So many people don't know what to say when they have a friend who's had a loss.
Yeah.
You know, and I think that kind of sense of like, I don't know what to say, comes from this mode of thinking of like, that you have to say something that will actually change what's true.
There it is.
Which is never possible.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
You know,
Exactly.
you can't, your words can't bring the loved one back, but
Yeah.
your words can comfort and console. And one of the things, one of the first things I wrote about deep grief was this essay called The Love of My Life. And it was part of the essay was about, you know, the ways that I was feeling so alone as a 20-something without a mom, because all of my friends had their moms. I felt like the only person on the planet who didn't have a mom.
Yeah.
Later, I went and found that tribe, but, you know, I didn't have them then. And they would all say to me, one thing I wrote in that essay is I'd say they wouldn't help me. They would tell me I needed to get help.
Wow.
So they would say, you need to get help. You need to go to therapy. But really, all I needed was someone to take a long walk with me and say, how are you feeling?
Yeah.
You know, it's a year and a half since your mom died. What are you feeling?
Yeah.
And I would, that would be all the help I needed. Because I knew that they couldn't give me what I wanted. I wanted my mom back. But if I couldn't get that, it would be nice just to have somebody who was willing to not avoid the subject.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's so
And
good.
if I do anything in this world as a writer, if I make any social impact, the most important thing for me is to have changed the way that people think about grief, not only their own grief, but how to be around the bereaved, how to talk to people about loss. and to realize that you don't have to have nobody has the answers.
Right.
Nobody's going to be the magic bunny who pulls the loved one out of the hat, or maybe is it the bunny that gets pulled out of the hat? I'm messing up my metaphors. But, just to be able to be sort of lucid and transparent and open-hearted and not afraid of that intensity, Sheila, that you talk about.
And to connect with them even in that grief. Like how beautiful that can be. You don't have to take it away. It's about like, I can be there with you even if that grief is there.
Yeah.
But the message, the constant cultural message is, if you don't like how you're feeling, something's wrong.
Yeah.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
Like, it'll get better, or there's a pill for it, or something.
Or go to therapy and then you'll feel
Or go to therapy,
different.
because therapists will just teach you to struggle more effectively.
Right.
Well, and like maybe I think these ways of thinking don't come from nowhere, right? I mean, we have generations upon generations of people who've said, don't bring up those difficult topics.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
So like my mother-in-law, she died a few years ago. All of her life, she was, if somebody, you could say in the first couple months, I'm sorry for your loss. But after that there's the dead person is not mentioned.
Oh, wow.
Because this will only make and she wasn't trying to be mean. She didn't want to upset the person.
Yeah.
Don't mention her son. She lost her son a couple months ago,
Right.
or and then it becomes the taboo subject. And what happens is that the person who's grieving is isolated.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And silence never makes anything better ever.
Oh, I completely agree.
As much as we're supposed to learn, right, how to walk with our own grief. We were talking about that,
Yeah.
right? Picking it up and carrying it with you. That's what we want from the people around us.
Yeah.
Like, I don't want you to try to make it better. I don't want you to avoid the touchy topic.
Yeah.
And if you get frustrated that after 8 months, 9 months, a year, whatever, I don't feel good, I just want you to walk with me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And listen, I mean, I think that's the biggest thing too, is listening. Like, I don't know what to say either, to somebody who's had a tremendous loss. It's like, all you can say is, I'm so sorry for your loss.
Right.
But the thing after that, I think, is to just ask the person, do you want to talk about the loved one? Do you want to tell me about what you're feeling? Or do you want to, to open the conversation, even if the bereaved is saying, let's just talk about shoes today.
Yes.
Let's go shoe
Yes.
shop. But sometimes it is like, I named my daughter Bobby after my mom, Bobby, because I wanted that word back in my life. I miss the word in my world, and because there is this sense of the not mentioning the dead person, and you don't want them to be dead. When you love somebody, you want them, as both of you said, that relationship continues on.
Yeah.
Jenna, when we were talking in advance of Cheryl coming in, I thought you made such an excellent point when you were saying most humans go around thinking that the world is a certain way and everything's going to work the way they do, and that the first time it falls out from underneath you, it's so devastating. And part of what happens with the grief is the anxiety that, oh my God, for the rest of my life, everything is going to go wrong.
Yeah.
Can you talk about how, if someone is in grief, that they can at least try not to complicate it with the additional anxiety that for the rest of your life, everything you touch, do, attempt is going to go bad?
Yeah. Or maybe let go of that idea that you could do something to try and control all of that stuff. Because I think that's like the myth that many people walk around with in the beginning is like, oh, I got this. Life is controllable. Life is predictable. And then something happens and the bottom falls out from under you and you're like, oh shit, life isn't. And what many people do then is, I have to work a lot harder to try and control it and try and like make sure nothing bad happens to me or my loved ones. And then your life gets so small because like actually living life is about living all, like your full broad life involves risk, including getting your heart broken or, losing somebody. And so I think that's the thing. It isn't about how do you help them regain control. It's about how do you help them get back to living their life in a way that is, I talk about this as kind of willing vulnerability, like opening up to like being vulnerable in this world. So that's how I talk about it.
It always just pisses me off because my sister, who became a Buddhist at 21, was just so right.
I know. They got it right. Life is
She was
suffering.
just so
you
right.
know?
Everything she had to say, everything she had to teach, everything she wanted me to take in then that I didn't really want to have to think about is now true. Is the thing. Cheryl Strayed, thank you so much for coming down today,
I had so
especially
much fun.
after your workout when you probably should have been pumping green juices into yourself.
I love being here. I could
Yeah, it
talk
was
to you all
really,
for another
really
hour. This
wonderful.
was really
Thanks.
fun. And thank you,
you
all
so
of you.
much.